So for this video, I decided to do something a little different. I have a shader in mind, and what I'm thinking is I want to do something that would be used if, say, you had a enemy or somebody you're shooting at and you want it to dissolve away in your game. So maybe turn it to some kind of, red glowing material and then slowly disappear like they were vaporized, right? So I have this in mind. I don't know at this time exactly how I'm going to do it. I have some ideas. So what I'm going to do is I will shoot each part as I figure it out, talk through that part, what I'm trying to do, and piece together the nodes to achieve that step. And then I'll figure out the next step and record that, and then of course piece it all together. So by the time you're watching this, I'll have figured it all out. But at this point, I do not know how I'm going to do this. It's a little different than I've done before, but I think it will help you when you're sitting down from scratch making your own shader. Exactly how do you work through the process, right? Nobody who posts these videos knows exactly what to do and can just whip it together. I don't think. I certainly don't. It takes some amount of figuring out each step along the way. So hopefully walking through these steps, it'll help you. It'll be a little longer. And if all you want is a video that says, hey, I want to know how to do this, I just want to see all the nodes in place so I can copy them, probably not the one. It'll take a little longer. But if you want to really understand the process and help you to figure out how to make your own shaders, then keep watching and let's figure this out. So to start out with, I basically have an empty shader that I've made a new shader, and I have made a new scene. And let's just take a look at that scene. I basically have our sphere. I have it assigned to a material that called dissolving image, and my dissolving image is using this dissolving shader that we're going to be working on. So we'll be able to see the results of this sphere. Pretty typical. So to start out with, I want an image. And I usually say, why create something new if I can copy and paste it? So I know from my tiling shader, if you watch my video on my first shader, we had an image. Let's just use this as a sample. Nothing special about it. So we're going to copy this and we're going to paste it into here. And we're going to hook that up to the color. Going to save that. Check out our scene. So pretty basic. We have the start. We just have our image in our scene, and we have our sphere. I'm just going to change this around so we can see it more lit from this side, and like that. All right. So what we want to do is we want to dissolve this away. And so one way to do that, to make something go away, we just have to multiply it by 0. Because anything multiplied by 0, of course, is 0. And as we go across this UV, remember the UV is plugged in and it's mapped to this image. If we multiply it by 0, it will go to black, which is a start. So let's move this over here. Let's create a noise mode node, not mode, noise mode, simple noise. There we go. So if we take this simple noise, so the noise, some of it's black, some of it's gray, some of it's white. It's all different random pixels in between across our UV. And if we take a multiply node and multiply the image, right, times the noise, what we see is anywhere that was black, it goes away. In dark of gray, it goes, and it will slowly go from the image to black. So if we save that, so what we have is we can see that it's affecting our image. So we've been able to affect our image. But what we want to do is we want to somehow affect the amount of image that goes away to black. So what we want to do is we want to take this simple noise and we want to somehow amplify it over some amount. So what do I want to do? So what I can do is I can subtract something off of this. If I subtract something off of it, it'll bring all the whites down. And remember, the color can't really get less than 0. We can always use a clamp if you watch my previous shader videos. But for now, what we're going to do is we are going to create a subtract node, just like we did on the other dissolving video. We use the subtract node there. So we're going to subtract some amount. And we'll get rid of this and we'll hook this up there. So if we subtract 1, the simple noise is creating numbers between 1 and 0. Essentially 1 is white, 0 is black. So we subtracted 1, so we subtracted everything off of this, which of course turned everything, nothing was greater than 0, because bright white 1 went to 0 and everything else went negative. So we don't want to subtract from 1, we want to control the amount. So I made this float called dissolve amount. It's set up as a slider between 0 and 3, and we'll hook that guy up. Defaults to 0. Let's save that. Now let's go back to our scene. Let's bring up the material. He's up here, dissolving image. There we go. So we have our dissolve amount and we have a slider. It's 0 right now, so it's unchanged. And as we go up, you'll see it faded to black. All right, so we're starting somewhere. We can control the amount that it fades, and we really don't want it to fade, but we'll work on that as we go along. So now let's go to this, but we don't want it to fade. We want it to actually disappear, right? At some point, we need this to actually go away, like it was dissolving away, right? He got blasted by a ray gun, and it is going to dissolve to nothing. We don't want it to go to black. And right now it's going to black. So if you remember what we've done in previous shaders is what we can do is we can come up to our fragment here, go to our graph settings. Right now it's opaque. So we can change it from opaque to transparent. And as soon as we did that, we have this alpha channel. And if you remember from the previous videos, the alpha channel actually, anything alpha 0 will be totally transparent. So alpha channel controls the amount of transparency. 1 is not transparent, 0 is totally transparent. So 0, anywhere where there's a 0 pixel, we can make that transparent. So let's feed the color into the alpha channel. So now anywhere there's black is going to be transparent. Let's save that guy. So now we can see that, well, it's all kind of dark. So it's actually pretty transparent to start with. And then if we increase it, okay, that's good. It did go away, but it started out too transparent. We want it solid to start out. When this dissolve amount is 0, we want this to be my full image. So that's the next problem. So let's go back to our resolving shader. So what we need to do is we need to brighten everything up. We need to increase all of these values. So let's take this noise, and instead of just subtracting it, right now it's between 0 and 1. Let's try adding and seeing if we can add that instead. We can grab this, drag it here, grab the output there, and let's add, say, 4 to it. So you'll notice right now the zeros now become 4, the whites become 5, so now it's a number between 4 and 5. And remember, we're going to subtract an amount, so what we want to do is let's make this dissolve amount between, right, so totally dissolved away, we need this to be 5. And when it's, oops, there we go. So now it's between 0 and 5. So it's solid. You'll see this is solid when this dissolve amount is 0, which is what we want. So let's save that asset. Let's go to the scene. See, now look at how bright it is. You notice how bright it is? It's brighter than everything around it because we've cranked up all the color values. If you've watched some of my previous videos on shaders, the brightness we a lot of times control by a value that was multiplied. Of course, now we're just adding. But what it's doing is it's increasing all the color values, right? And that affects the brightness. So we may want to clamp this or affect it, but for now we're just seeing, okay, it starts out fully bright. You'll notice we still see a little bit of shadow there. And as we crank this up, now you'll see it starts from the bottom left because this is being affected by the color, right? The brightness of the material is affecting the alpha. So that might be a problem. It might not be a problem, but for now it's starting out bright and it goes all the way to 0, which is what we want, right? All right. So we could put a time node in this and instead of my slider, but I'm going to be using my sliders here. And in the end, we can attach a time node and we can trigger that to start our dissolve once we're finished. But we got to figure out all the nodes. So, okay. So we've kind of got our first step. I know how to go from full color, boom, down to nothing. But that's not really what I want. What I want to do really is I want to first replace it with some material that looks like he has been blasted with something. Something I'm thinking, you know, yellow and reds and oranges. It would be really cool is if it could animate to kind of like this electrical, you know, plasma field maybe look. That's what I'm thinking of. So that's what I'm going to try to figure out. How can I replace this color first before I dissolve it away? I want to replace it with something like a shifting plasma look. So let's work on that next. But of course, I don't know how to do it. So I'm recording this as I'm figuring it out. So all I'm going to have to do is figure that out next before I let you know how I did it. All right, so I've kind of worked through what we could do to make our kind of red, orange, and yellow kind of plasma looking thing as far as our shader goes. So let's see what we need. So one, we're going to need some color inputs. So let's start with that. So let's make 2 colors. We'll call it pattern color 1. We'll add another color, call pattern color 2. All right. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to mix those 2 colors together in somewhat of a random fashion. So how are we going to mix those 2 colors? Well, there's this node called lerp. And if you've watched some of my other videos, lerp just stands for linear interpretation. And so it's going to mix 2 things together based on an input value. That's what this is. And we'll see what it does. So if we drag this here, we drag this here, and we're going to hook up this guy to 1 and this guy to this one. So what it's going to do is, let's default these so we can see what's happening. Let's default this one to yellow. And we're going to default this one to red. All right. And now what's going to happen is if this number is 0, it's going to show it all red. And if this one is 1, it's going to show all yellow. And so what we want it to do is mix it in some more random fashion, which of course calls for a noise. So let's make a noise. Let's try this gradient noise. Little different looking noise pattern. So now if we feed it into here, we can see we get this nice kind of random mix of yellow and red, right? But the thing is we want it to move and change over time. I mean, this is fine. We could just replace it with this, but you know, I'm thinking like a plasma color. We want it to move and shift around. So we've done that in my previous video. We've kind of combined noises together using tiling and offset, right? So tiling and offset, we move one noise pattern in one direction, we move another noise pattern in another direction, then we combine them together. So let's try that. Let's get rid of this. Let's duplicate this guy. So we got two noise patterns. Let's create a tiling and offset node. Again, if you're not familiar with these, I do use these in previous videos that I go over in great detail how all these work. So you can watch those videos. It would take forever to go over every single detail. That's why these kind of videos kind of build on each other from the very first simple one on up. So now what we need, of course, is a time node because we want to be moving these, right? We want to be offsetting these, and we want to offset this one in one direction, this one in another direction. And if you watch my other videos, we have this 1 minus. So I know I have this 1 minus node that I can feed into here. All right, he's going in that direction. Then we can feed him into here. He's going in the other direction. All right, so we've done that before in the other shaders. So let's move it over here. And then we want to add them together. So let's do an add node. I'm going to add this guy. We're going to add this guy. We notice it gets pretty bright because, of course, each one of these is between 0 and 1. This one's 0 and 1. So this one's going to be between 0 and 2. More between 1 and 2, which of course, again, remember the colors, they max out at 1. They do get brighter, of course, but we want to tone it down a bit. So let's subtract, get these down a little less bright, and let's do it by 0.7. I did this before in a previous video. So once you've done a couple of these, you kind of get to know the nodes, kind of what combinations of nodes will get you the result you want. So it kind of becomes easier, especially if you're doing something similar. So let's move this closer. Now let's feed this into my lerp amount. So now what we have is we have a nice moving mix of reds, yellows, and oranges. So of course we get the orange because these numbers aren't 0 and 1. They're all shades of gray, really, numbers between 0 and 1. So if it was 0.5, it's going to be mixing this red and yellow evenly, which of course gives us orange. But it gives us a nice pattern, moving pattern between yellow and red. So I'm going to grab these. There we go. Let's move them in a little closer. So let's move these away a little bit. Give us some room. And we'll drag him right into the color. And of course we got to get rid of the alpha for now. So let's just delete him. Let's just see what this looks like. Yep, we're still transparent, but our alpha is 1. So we'll save that. Take a look at our scene. Of course, unless we're in our game mode, we're not going to see it real time because the scene doesn't always update the same way. So let's just run this. So now we got this nice swirling pattern. It's a little, it's a little fast, one. So we need to slow this guy down. So how are we going to do that? Well, of course, what we can do is, this is all driven by this time element. So if we divide him, we can multiply it by a number less than 1, or we can divide it. So let's feed this guy into here. Let's delete him, delete him. Let's divide it by, let's say 4. Let's try a number. We could always make this another slider, but I don't think that's necessary. I think we can pick a number, take a look. Yeah, so see, that's a lot slower. I think that's better. Let's take a look at our, let's run this now. Take a look at our pattern. So that's looking pretty good. I think that, to me, that looks like kind of a plasma looking, swirling yellow to red looking pattern. So I'm pretty happy with that. So what we want to do now is we want to replace our normal pattern, whatever the character's bitmap and mapping looked like before he was hit, with this pattern. So how are we going to do that? Well, we mixed these two colors with a lerp node. So we could use a lerp node to combine this image to this image, right? Feeding in a value between 1 and 0. So let's add another lerp node. All right. Now let's drag him to this guy. And we are going to drag him to this guy. Then we're going to make another float called, could use that dissolve amount. Let's do, let's call it combine amount. Yeah, I do that. It doesn't matter. All right. Let's feed this into him. We're going to make this guy a slider between 0 and 1. Default to 0. And then we're going to feed this guy into that. So let's save that. Let's go back to our scene. We have to bring up our material, of course, so we can see our sliders. Now let's play this just so we can see it in real time. So now we can see when it's 1. Probably should have done it opposite, but that doesn't matter. We can see as we can fade from one to the other. But, when he's hit, we don't really want to fade between. What we want is, I'm thinking we want in blotches, right? The blotches start out small and they kind of grow, right, until it envelops the whole the whole character that's being hit. And we could start. It'd be nice if it started at the point of impact, but that's kind of complicated because how do we know where it was impacted and how would we affect that in the shader? I'm not sure how to do that. So for now, what we're going to do is we just want it to, like the plasma is taking them over, starting out little blotches that grow bigger instead of, fading over time. So I don't know how to do that. I have some ideas. I'm thinking maybe a noise texture, maybe at a very, small scale factor, and then subtracting, right, to start it out, or adding to start it out, maybe at all black or all white, and then we slowly modify that subtraction to make it grow bigger and bigger and bigger. I think that'll work, but I'm gonna have to try that out and figure out how to make that work, and then we'll go through those steps and kind of piece by piece how that could work. So now we're going to work on trying to figure out how to make our pattern, our kind of plasma pattern, instead of fading, it will start and take over small patches that will kind of grow until they envelop the whole object. So what I'm thinking is that if we make our noise, it's a simple noise, we set this maybe to 10. So that's going to give us kind of general shaded blobs, but they're all between 0 and 1. Remember, a noise is between 0 and 1. So what we want to do is we want to basically increase the patches of black. And so what we can do is, actually we can do this faster this way. We can subtract. So if we subtract this from 1, basically we get nothing. So we want to control how much we get rid of, right? So we have this dissolve amount that we were using before to affect our lerp. It's not in there right now, but that's what we were using it for. So I have it down here, so I'll drag this guy up and I'll connect the dissolve amount to there. So it's defaulting to 0.5, which of course is getting rid of about half of what we have. So we see big patches of black and some patches of not white, but different shades of gray. Everything that was between 0.5 and 1 is now between 0 and, or actually negative 0.5 and 0.5. So what we want to do is we're going to clamp this. We're going to clamp it because we don't want any negative values. So we're going to clamp it between 0 and 1. So basically this gets rid of any negative values. So now everything is between 0 and 0.5. But we still have shades of gray between 0 and 0.5. So what we want is we want to turn everything that was 0 black, and we want to turn everything that was not 0 to white. So what we can do is we need to increase all these values. So we're going to create and we're going to multiply this. We're going to multiply it by quite a bit just to make sure that everything is big enough. So we don't want anything. We don't want anything that's not 0. We want to make sure it's 1. So let's just multiply it by 20. It's just a number. It can be any number. It really doesn't matter as long as it's big enough. And then, but now a lot of these numbers are way bigger than 1. So what we want is everything in the white is 1, everything in the black is 0, with nothing in between. We don't want any little shades of gray at all. So now a lot of them are too big. So what we can do is we can clamp this again. So we still, I don't know if this is accurate, this little shades of gray. If we made this 40, I still see that. So I think this is looking pretty good. We have a solid white and black. So let's see what that looks like. We can just throw it on here. We can save this. We can go to our scene, and we see we still see some shades of gray here, which I don't really want. But for the time being, I think that gets us what we need. The question is this is a pretty big shade of white, and I'm not sure what it would look like. What should the size of this noise be? So I'm going to let us adjust that. I'll just say noise scale. Let's drag it down here. And, oops, it did not connect that. Oops, that is not a, what did I make here? I want to make it a float. All right. I don't know what that sample state is. Get rid of the noise scale. hook it up here, make it a slider between 10 and say 200. Let's default it to something bigger like 50. All right, let's save this. Let's go to our scene. So we can see when our dissolve amount is 0, it's going to be solid white because we're not subtracting anything. And when it goes up, see, we can see that the black areas kind of take over the white. And if we change our noise scale, we can kind of see what is the size of those patches. So what's going to look good? I think something like this. We can imagine it being our solid graphic, and slowly the plasma area takes over. It looks pretty good. So now how do we hook up our images? So right now, this is generating our white. Everywhere there's white, we want to make our normal image. We want this image to come through when it's white. So I think grabbing these guys, moving them down here, let's kind of do some rearranging here. Move these down, move this guy down out of the way. These are some items we don't need anymore. All right, now we got this guy here. We got this guy here. So we were combining them together with this slurp. We don't need that because we're not going to use that because that didn't look very good. So instead, we got this guy and this guy. And we are going to, let's move him over there. We're going to want to multiply this times this. And let's see what that looks like. Let's drag him. Let's do a multiply. Multiply him by him. So now you can see everywhere there was white is now this image. Let's feed him out here instead. Save that. Take a look at our scene. Now we got our dissolve amount. See, we can see right now it's dissolving away to black, right? But we really want to dissolve away to our plasma image. So how do we do that? Well, what we want to do is we want everywhere there's black, we want to make it appear this plasma image. So what we want to do is we want to multiply it, but we want to multiply by the opposite of this. So we can do that 1 minus. 1 minus will essentially reverse our colors. So now we see the 1 minus gives us white everywhere there was black and black everywhere there was white, which is what we want. And now let's maybe move this back here, move this over here, because we're going to want to multiply these two together. Let's do a multiply. Going to multiply this times this. So now we can see everywhere they're just the opposites, right? Everywhere there was black, there's now our plasma, and the opposite is true here. So now we can just add these together. Since they are basically opposites each other, so we can add those two together here. Let's do this like this, this like this. Let's move him over there. So now we can see we have them combined together, and right now it's at a 50% because that's what we defaulted the one dissolve value to, and now we can hook up that there. Let's save this guy. Go to our scene. Now with our dissolve amount, we can see as we dissolve away, we can see it's being replaced by our plasma look. And now that I see this with little patches, I don't like. I think this should be a little higher, a little smaller patches there than those big ones. And the other thing is that it's being stretched. We could create an image instead. There's lots of things that you can do to tweak these to improve the look depending on how you want. Generating the image, it's going to be stretched. If you make a tiled image, then you can make it. You can fix that, right? You can affect the tiling amount, and you can affect how big the pixels are with that image. But for now, I think this is working fine. But it would be nice to get these values. Remember, these scale values here are what's controlling this pattern. So let's up these to like 50 and 50 and see what they look like. We could make sliders for this too if we really wanted to play around with it. But for now, let's see what this looks like. Yeah, I think that looks good. Let me bring this down a little bit. All right, so now we've seen how we can imagine when our guy is hit by its plasma gun or whatever, that he will be slowly taken over by this. And now the last thing we want to do is we want to now dissolve the plasma thing to 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to make these patches appear. It will transition to the plasma and then fade away. And all this is going to run pretty fast. So that's the other thing is when you're doing these, you're like, okay, this looks great here, but what's it going to look like once it's implemented, say, in a game, and it is all going to happen maybe over a second and a half or maybe 2 seconds period. That goes pretty fast. So you don't really know, right? You do all this, you play around with it, you look at the final one, and maybe you're happy with it, maybe you're not. So now the last thing to do is once this happens, now we want to follow that with a fade away to 0. So let's work on that next and piece it all together and see what the end looks like. All right, so what I'm thinking about for this last part is that as we see this dissolve, see how these things kind of spread out, about right here, I want to actually start dissolving away from the same areas that we're adding to our plasma. I want to expand out the same way. So this kind of plasma wave that's kind of enveloping our image will slowly fade away from kind of the inside out. So you have more of this edge that's expanding out. So how are we going to do that? Well, what I'm thinking here is that we really want to take the same pattern that expanded out to replace, right? This pattern is being used with a 1- in order to expand out our plasma looking pattern. So what I want to do is I want to take that, but I want to delay it. So I want to take the same time that is generating our pattern here. See our simple noise, we're subtracting it. Actually, we don't have it hooked up to time right now. We just have it hooked up to our slider. But our same slider value, that's this dissolve amount, I want to feed into the same set of nodes, except I want them delayed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this dissolve amount, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract off of it. So I'm going to subtract off some value, and in this case, when we looked, it was right about at 0.3, which I thought we could start dissolving away. So I'll subtract 0.3 off of that. So now this value will be 0.3 behind this dissolve amount. Now that means that it'll start out negative, and I don't want it negative. What I want it 0 until this reaches 0.3. And then once it's 0.3, I want it 0. When this is 0.4, which means this is expanded out, I want this to be 0.1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clamp this right here between 0 and 1, so it won't be less than 1. I'm not sure what would happen if we fed a negative value into those. It might mess things up. Just easier to clamp it just to make sure. And then what I'm going to do is I want to take all these nodes, oops, and I want to copy them. I want to duplicate those. And we want to get rid of this. And we want to duplicate that and feed in the subtract amount. So now the subtract amount is going to be 0.3 behind. So essentially what's going to happen is that this is going to just be this is just going to be a little delayed from expanding out. So our alpha is going to be delayed in how quickly it expands out. I'm looking at this because it is, I'm coming off of there. This is going through there. It's clamping. It's subtracting. Oh, because it's, yes, it's a lot wider because, of course, it is 0.3 behind this one. So it should look a little different. So what we can do just to validate that this is exactly what we want, and this, it's easier to visualize it. So I'm going to just drag this up here. So we'll replace that. We're going to save the asset, or save the shader, go to our scene. So at 0, the dissolve amount is that. See, so once we hit 0.3, we start to see, right? And that's perfect. It's going to black. And remember, we're going to be feeding this into the alpha channel. So black means transparent. So that's perfect. It's going to be whole, so we will see our other plasma take it over, and then right after 0.3, that plasma will start to dissolve away to nothing. So by the time we reach this, it will be totally transparent. All right. So this kind of gets us what we want. We got our subtract to make it behind. We got our exact same pattern, and we want the same pattern. And then now what we can do is grab this guy and hook it back up to the alpha. So remember, 0 for alpha is transparent and 1 is whole. So it'll start out as 100% and it will fade to transparent, and it will be 0.3 behind. So once we hook this up to time, it will just be 0.3 seconds behind the other expansion. All right, let's bring our dissolve amount back to 0. So we're sliding. So here we see our plasma expanding. So now we can see even before all of this is taken over, it's going to start being replaced by transparent, right? And then you see the transparent dissolve away. I like it. Really don't know how it's going to look until it's hooked up to a character. But I think this is the effect that I was thinking of when we started this whole thing. So we have our shader all hooked up. So this is our completed shader. We have our pattern. Again, we could replace this with a different image if we wanted to, a tiling image. Then we have our mix of dissolving the image to our new image pattern. And then we have our nodes that are going to dissolve that away, feeding into the alpha channel. And remember, the alpha channel only works, right? The surface has to be marked transparent, which gives us this alpha which can mess things up in certain environments. And there's a lot of other things we could do to here. We could make it look better. Maybe, change this pattern. Maybe you'd want to add some emissions or something to make it more sparkly. You can take atmospheric into account. There's lots and lots of tweaks you can do to polish this up. But this is the fundamental basic shader that's going to kind of give us the effect we want. And now what we have to do is we have to hook it up to see it run with an actual time. But the tricky part about that is as soon as you start a game scene, the time starts going at 0 and it just starts counting up. And so if we use a time node, this is like a one-time only deal. Once the time reaches a certain period, it's the image is gone. And so we want to not use a time node. We need to, as soon as he's hit, then we want to start counting up and feeding values in. And if we use a time node, that's not going to happen. So what I'm going to do next is I'll write a little script. I'm going to put an actual character that I have in the scene, and I'm going to hook it up to script so we can kind of see how you would make this run from script. So let's work on that next. All right, so this is what I've done to hook this up to a scene to see what it would look like. So what I've done is I removed our sphere, our test sphere, and I added in just a robot character that, if you watch some of my other videos, I had him walking around. So I kind of brought him in to use. I disabled the animator because I don't want him walking. I disabled his normal script, which had him kind of stomping around if you watch that video. And I added a different script called Dissolve Robot. And what I did in the Dissolve shader is not much change, but what I did is I added, so instead of our dissolve amount here, which was our slider test, I added this time from script variable, which is exposed. And what you can do is you can actually access any of these exposed variables from your script in a shader. So what I'm going to do is when I simulate a hit, I'm going to actually start feeding in the time from my script itself. So instead of a timer node, I will just read the time in my script so I can start that time whenever I want. And what's important is that seal name, you see on this, there's a name. This is just the name, for the interface. It's not the name that the code uses. It's pretty common that you create a name, an exposed name for a UI, and you have a different name. That's generally a generated name, and that's what this name is, this reference name instead. So this is the name you need to use in your script. Now you could change this name, and I watched a video to figure this out, and in that video they copy and pasted this name into this, which you can do. Again, these nodes are it's actually creating a text script that's actually compiled for you, and you can look at that script and you can kind of see how that name is used. But the fact is this reference name is the one you need to use in your code if you want to set that variable. So I just copy and pasted this. It's just as easy as renaming. And what I have is, we'll show it here. Drag this guy over. It's pretty simple script. It just has a current time that's going to count up the time. It has a Boolean, a make dissolve Boolean, because we want to know when we want to start sending that time to our script. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the value of our time to 0, because the problem is there's only one script. Meaning not one script, there's only one actual shader instance, if you will. And if I assign this shader to multiple objects, it's actually going to affect all the objects the same way, because there's not a single instance of shader per object. So if that was the case, you'd have to change the material when it's hit from whatever normal material they had to this shader material. But we won't go into that. For now, I just have one object, and I'm going to set it to 0. And that's because every time I played it, it doesn't reset to 0 automatically. I need to do that myself. So I set it to 0. So this is the code you do that. In my case, my object itself doesn't have the material, and I can show that in a second. But it's actually, it has an armature and a actual mesh. So I needed to find the child off my game object for my mesh. So when it was called robot body, and I check it for null, of course, and as long as I got a robot, what I do is this is actually a transform, because that's what children, you get it off the transform. So I need to grab its game object off the transform, and then I get the render component. Remember, all the components that you see in the inspector, in the UI, can be accessed from code. So the render actually holds the shader. It holds the shader material in this shared material. You could just do dot material, I think works too. I've seen that in the documentation. And then what I do is I want to set the float value. Of course, this is the reference value that I copy and pasted out of our UI, and I wanted to set it to 0. And then down here, if I hit the space key, that will simulate our object being hit. I'm going to set our Boolean to true. And of course, every time it hits this update, if this is true, I am going to start counting up the time. And I did the time and it seemed kind of fast. So we can affect the speed of how fast it dissolves by just increasing this number. It just makes this count up slower. And then, in fact, let's just do it just so we can kind of see it in slow motion, make this 5. Down here, I'm going to find the robot body again, and I'm going to apply that time. So every time in the update, I will be increasing this value of our float in our shader. So since I made a change, I'm going to build that guy, drag him back over here. We can go to our scene, and we can see our robot. This is our robot. You can kind of see it has, this is the game object. The game object itself doesn't have a mesh or a render because it holds an armature and a robot body. The robot body is the one that actually has the material. You'll see I have the dissolving image material here. In this case, it has 2 materials, and I have this glow material. So the glow material is not going to dissolve away, which is another problem that you kind of have to fix depending on how your objects are set up. If they have 2 materials, I would have to assign both to our dissolver. Would have to be able to handle 2 materials. Not a big deal, but for now you'll notice that the red part won't dissolve away. So we have our guy. He's assigned to the dissolve material, and we're gonna play. So now we just see him. He looks normal because of course the time is 0. So the regular old image shows up. I'm going to hit the space bar, and we see he slowly dissolves away. And again, he's doing it pretty slow because I have that dissolve factor, which of course you can change depending on how you want to do it. You'll notice he's gone here because that value is still non-zero, right? If I play again, my start is going to set him back to 0, so he appears again. So let's see that again. So you'll see it. See now that pattern, it doesn't look great the way it's stretched over that material. So if you really wanted to get precise, you could make your own graphic to show that. I do like how it moves though. I mean, you do get that effect kind of as it takes over, right? But it depends on how you have your UV maps and how it's going to map to to that image, because remember the image is square. Obviously the way it maps to it, it's going to be kind of stretched depending on how that works. But you'll notice this guy, of course, didn't dissolve because of course it's not assigned to the same material. So, but I think we've achieved what we were looking for. It dissolves away to our sparkly, and then it dissolves away to nothing, and he's vaporized. So, we could go back, quick change this to, if we change it back to 2, we'll see that we'll build this guy, drag him back over there, come over here, play it again. Of course, now it goes faster. Probably what you might want. It would look cool. I would really like to. It'd be nicer to start at the impact point. So if he got hit in the chest, it would start in the chest and kind of spread out. Much more difficult to figure out how to do that. You could make it dissolve from a single point, but what if that single point started on his back or something? It would have to be at the impact point, and I'm not sure quite how to do that. Maybe I'll investigate that and do a video on that later, but I think this kind of pulls it all together. I know this is a little longer, but hopefully it helps you be able to work through yourself. When you sit down to make your own shader after watching videos like this, are you gonna know kind of how to go about doing it from scratch? Because that's the hard part. You look at it, you go, oh, that looks pretty easy. You sit down and you're like, I don't even know how to go about doing this, But I will say that the more you work with the nodes and the more you kind of get this pattern down, you start to work off that pattern. And so it becomes easier, and it does take practice. But I hope this really helped you understand, maybe a more complicated shader and how to put things together. But there's one last thing I'd like to go over before I go. And I was thinking about the look of our dissolve, and it doesn't really look that great. One, my mesh is not mapped over the whole character. It's mapped, each whole mesh is mapped to each individual polygon, which didn't give it a great look, and it would look a lot better probably on a character with the image mapped a little bit different. But also, I was thinking of playing around with how the dissolve looks, whether really the thickness of the dissolve. And I played around in it. I made some changes that made it look a little bit better. If we look here, I went back to my slider just so I could play around with it. And what I've done is I have done a couple things. One, I fed the output into the emission. So you get kind of a bright glowing edge, which I thought would look a lot better. And even if you did just a solid material, you could do like a bright red or orange, whatever you think looks best. But the emission does give it that kind of like a fiery glow. And then the issue is that it also would feed the total image, the normal image, into the emission, would make it too bright. So I just I divided it by 3 here. It's a divide. So I took the sample texture. Dividing it just makes it a little darker. And then when it's fed into the emission, it kind of offsets that. So the image isn't too bright. And then what I also did is let's go over here. I added in a slider that I could adjust this dissolve amount, the dissolve width. And you'll see the effect of that when we go to our scene. We'll look at this sphere, and if we go to our dissolve image, when I do this, see this dissolve width? Instead of 0.3, it's actually 0.029, which is pretty small. And you'll see what happens when I dissolve is that you just get the very edge, see, of our image. It's a lot brighter because it's going into the emission. And so you get this edge like it's burning away, right, the image, versus converting the image and then disappearing. See if I change this width, see it's going to change the width of that dissolve. So you can play around with this, come up with an amount that you like. See if it's too thin, you barely see it. See, something like that I think looks a lot nicer as it dissolves away and being uniformly spread on my whole image or on my whole mesh. So again, you kind of got to think about it. You look at it, you play around with a few more things. There's always ways to improve things. You never get it right the first time. So just something to keep in mind as you're playing around with these shaders yourself. And that should pretty much wrap it up. Hope you enjoyed the video and it helped you. And if you like my videos, you can always subscribe to the channel. I have lots of other videos that go over all the steps of these shaders, so you can check those out. Also, lots of others that cover other aspects of Unity. So, again, thanks for watching, and see you next video.